All right, so we're diving into Herman Melville's Moby-Dick, and I've been looking over these book reviews you sent, and wow, I gotta say, I'm ready to really unpack this one. It's a pretty epic tale, but reading through these, I was kind of surprised to see that it's so much more than just a whaling adventure, you know?
Yeah, it is. It's really captivating how Melville starts with this, like, simple idea, you know, a man hunting a whale. And he turns it into this, like, profound look at obsession and revenge and, like, where human ambition can go. It's almost like he's using the ocean to, like, show us the depths of the human mind.
Okay, so we've got Captain Ahab. He's just driven by this need to catch the white whale that took his leg. And, one of the reviewers called him a grand, ungodly, godlike man. I mean, what a way to describe him, right? I mean, it really gets at how complex his character is.
Yeah, it really is brilliant, isn't it? I mean, Ahab is terrifying, but there's something about him that you just can't look away from. He's just consumed by this need for revenge. But there's also something really compelling about just how determined he is. It kind of makes you think, how far would any of us go to right or wrong? Like, where's the line between getting justice and just being obsessed?
That's a really great point, and it's made even more interesting when you compare him to Starbuck. I mean, he's the voice of reason on the Pequod, right? He's always trying to get Ahab to stop before it's too late, reminding him about how dangerous this whole quest is.
Exactly. Starbuck is like the practical side of being human, the rational side.
Yeah.
He's like the opposite of Ahab, who's kind of this wild, almost mythical figure.
Yeah.
And the conflict between them, I think he shows us this tension that's inside all of us. We have this drive to chase our desires no matter what, but we also need to know when to stop and realize our limits.
It's funny. I was just thinking how Ahab's obsession with Moby-Dick is kind of like what we see today with some of these business rivalries. Like, you see these companies that are just battling each other so fiercely. Sometimes they go to crazy lengths to win. It's like a modern day version of Ahab and the white whale. You know what I mean?
Wow, that's a really great comparison. It shows how these themes from Moby-Dick are still so relevant, even in places you wouldn't expect. I mean, we all have our own white whales, right? Mm-hmm. Those things that we just can't stop thinking about and that drive us. But the important thing is to recognize when that pursuits, when it starts to hurt us more than it helps.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about this friendship that's at the heart of the book. Ishmael and Queequeg, it's more than just like a random buddy story, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's way more than that. Melville is using this bond between Ishmael, the narrator, and Queequeg, this Polynesian harpooner who's covered in tattoos, to kind of critique, the racial prejudices of his time. And remember, this is the 1800s. People thought about race and culture in a totally different way back then.
Right, but even then you see this incredibly respectful and tender portrayal of this cross-cultural friendship.
Exactly. And Melville doesn't shy away from showing us how Ishmael is scared and suspicious of Queequeg at first. But then he shows us how that fear turns into understanding and then real affection. There's this great line where Ishmael's looking at Queequeg's tattoos and he thinks, better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. It's like a powerful statement about how we need to challenge our assumptions and look past, just what's on the surface.
That's a perfect example of how Melville weaves these deeper social messages into the story without hitting you over the head with them.
He's a master at layering, meaning, think about how different Ishmael and Queequeg's friendship is compared to Ahab, who's so isolated and obsessed. It's like Melville saying that maybe the way to fight the destructive power of obsession is through human connection, by being able to bridge those divides between cultures.
Okay, so we've got this really fascinating and complicated main character in Ahab, this really thought-provoking look at race and friendship with Ishmael and Queequeg. But there's even more to this book, right? The reviewers both said how Moby-Dick is so much more than just an adventure story. It's almost like a tapestry made up of all these different threads.
You're exactly right. Melville blends all these different elements into the story. Cetology, philosophy, even theatrical dialogue. He'll give us these really detailed descriptions of whale anatomy and how whaling worked in the 1800s. And then suddenly he's going off on these philosophical tangents about the meaning of life. It's like he's challenging the reader to keep up with him.
I love that image of a tapestry, and it makes me think about those gams, those encounters with other ships. Those aren't just random events, are they?
Oh, no, definitely not. Each gam gives us a different perspective on Moby-Dick, and it kind of foreshadows what's going to happen to the Pequod in the end. They're like little glimpses into this bigger tragedy that's unfolding, and they really add to this feeling of impending doom,
And each gam also gives us more insight into the crew and what motivates them. You start to see how Ahab's obsession is slowly spreading to everyone on the ship.
It's like a slow-burning fuse, and Melville uses these encounters to, like, crank up the tension, building up to this huge climax that you just know is coming.
One thing that really stood out to me in the reviews was how they both praised Melville's writing, but they also admitted that it can be pretty tough. It's not exactly a light beach read, is it?
No, not really. One of the reviewers used the term stylistic density, which I think describes it pretty well. Melville's writing is so rich and layered. He's mixing nautical jargon with biblical references and Shakespeare, and everyday speech is this crazy mix that's fascinating, but it can be overwhelming, and it definitely demands your full attention.
So it's not just the whale that's a challenge to grapple with, it's the language itself.
Exactly, but that's part of what makes it so rewarding. You're not just passively reading it. Melville wants you to engage, to work a little, to figure out the complexities of his language, just like Ahab is trying to figure out the mysteries of the white whale.
I was really interested by this mention of Homeric similes in one of the reviews. What's that all about?
Well, similes are those figures of speech where you use like or as to compare things. And Homer, the ancient Greek poet who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, he was really famous for using these really epic and long similes that would sometimes go on for lines and lines. Melville is drawing on that tradition to create these really vivid and expansive comparisons that take the story beyond just a simple tale about whaling.
So it's like he's taking this ancient way of storytelling and making it his own,
Exactly. And these similes do more than just create striking images. They also connect the story of Ahab and Moby-Dick to these bigger universal themes,
Okay, so we've talked about obsession and friendship and literary style, and we've just touched on the idea of symbolism. We know that Moby-Dick himself can be interpreted in many ways, but one of the reviewers mentioned a specific object, the doubloon. It's nailed to the mast of the Pequod, and each crew member sees it differently. They each have their own interpretation of what it means.
Yeah, it's brilliant how Melville uses that to explore how truth is subjective and how our perceptions shape our reality. Every character projects their own desires and fears onto the doubloon, just like they project them onto the white whale. It's like Melville is inviting us, the readers, to come up with our own interpretation, So I'll throw this out to you listening out there. What do you think Moby-Dick symbolizes? Is it nature's indifference, the destructive power of obsession? What is it?
It's a question we're thinking about as we go further into this epic tale. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll be looking at how Melville tackles these really important social issues, even though this book was written so long ago. We're talking about race and colonialism and how they're woven into Moby-Dick. Stay tuned. It's really interesting when we start to think about race and colonialism in Moby-Dick. Melville uses this really diverse crew on the Pequod to kind of challenge those ideas about social hierarchy that were so common back in his time. Yeah, that's right. You've got Queequeg, Tashtego, and Daggoo. They're all from different racial and cultural backgrounds, and they're not just there for show. They're a really important part of the story, and the ship wouldn't really work without them.
Right. Look at Queequeg. He's not just Ishmael's best friend. He's also an amazing harpooner. I mean, he might even be the best one on the whole ship. And Melville is kind of subtly pushing back against those racist ideas that were so common in the 19th century. He's showing us that Queequeg is intelligent and capable and even spiritual,
And his tattoos, the same ones that scared Ishmael at first. They end up being these symbols of Queequeg's culture and his connection to this whole world outside of Western society.
Like Melville is saying, hey, there's more to these cultures than you think. There's beauty and wisdom and a deep understanding of nature.
And then there's Tashtego, the Native American, who's so good at climbing the mast and spotting whales. He represents this connection to the land and a way of life that colonialism is really threatening,
His skills are totally key to the voyage. But his fate, being tied to the sinking of the Pequod, it's like a foreshadowing of what happens when colonialism wins and indigenous cultures are destroyed.
And we can't forget about Daggoo, the African harpooner. He's always described as this powerful figure, almost imposing. He reminds us of the strength of people who have been enslaved and oppressed.
And him being on the ship with Queequeg and Tashtego, it's like this tiny version of the world. It highlights how all these cultures are connected and how colonialism has impacted the entire globe.
It's interesting that Melville doesn't try to hide the racial tensions on the Pequod. Remember that scene where a fight breaks out between the white sailors and the non-white crew members? It's like a stark reminder that even out at sea, all those divisions from society are still there.
Yeah, it's like this miniature version of the world, and it forces us to confront those really uncomfortable truths about racial inequality and what colonialism has left behind. Melville's not just telling an adventure story. He's making us look at ourselves and examine our own prejudices.
And then there's Pip, the young African-American cabin boy. His story is just heartbreaking.
It really is. Pip being abandoned at sea and going mad. It's like this powerful statement about what slavery and racism do to people, you know? It strips them of their humanity.
It's like Melville is saying, this is what happens when you treat people like they're disposable, when you take away their dignity and their sense of belonging.
It's a really sad reminder of the cost of these oppressive systems. And Pip's fate, just like Tashdego's, kind of foreshadows the tragedy that's coming for the entire ship and everyone on it.
It's interesting how even though we're talking about all these serious themes, Melville still finds ways to be funny. You know, there are parts of the book with humor and wordplay and even satire.
Oh, for sure. He uses humor to kind of balance things out, you know, so instead to get too heavy or preachy. Like, remember that scene where Ishmael and Queequeg are trying to sell shrunken heads? It's hilarious. And it makes fun of those weird cultural practices and how people try to make money off of things that are different.
I know, right? It's like Melville is giving us a little wink, you know, like, hey, don't take this all too seriously. We can still laugh even when we're dealing with tragedy and huge philosophical questions.
Exactly. That's what makes Moby-Dick so great. You can laugh and think and question everything you thought you knew all at the same time.
Okay, before we get to that really dramatic ending of the book, I want to go back to Melville's writing style for a second. We were talking earlier about those Homeric similes. Can you give us an example of how he uses them in the book?
Sure. Remember that scene where Ahab is talking to the crew for the first time and he tells them about how obsessed he is with Moby-Dick? He describes the whale as having this pyramidical white hump and this wrinkled brow.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's such a vivid image, you can almost see Moby-Dick coming out of the water.
Right. And then Melville compares how the whale moves to the leagues-long wake of the scombersox, which is this fish that's super fast and agile. It's a simile that goes on for a while, and it makes Moby-Dick seem like this really powerful and mysterious creature, almost mythical, you know?
It's not just a simple comparison. It's this really elaborate description that makes the whale seem like more than just an animal. It's like he's comparing Moby-Dick to a god or a force of nature.
That's exactly it. That's the power of those Homeric similes. They elevate the language and connect the story to these big universal themes. They make you feel like you're watching something truly amazing, even though the story is heading towards this really sad ending.
You know, while we're talking about this, I'm struck by how Melville foreshadows what's going to happen to the Pequod through those encounters with other ships, the Gams. Each one is like a warning, a little glimpse of what could happen because of Ahab's obsession.
Yeah, it's really clever storytelling. Remember that Gam with the Jeroboam where they meet that crazy prophet who warns Ahab about going after Moby-Dick? Or the one with the Rachel where the captain is frantically searching for his son who's been lost at sea? These Gams aren't just random. They're carefully placed throughout the story, hinting at the tragic ending that's coming.
And each one emphasizes that Ahab's quest isn't just about revenge. It's about this bigger struggle between humans and the power of nature. And it's a struggle that Ahab is going to lose.
Exactly. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll talk about that tragic ending, the final battle between Ahab and Moby-Dick, and the terrible consequences of Ahab's obsession. But we'll also talk about the little bit of hope that comes out of all the destruction, that even when you experience a huge loss, there's always a chance for redemption and starting over. So stay with us.
All right, so we've talked about Ahab and his obsession and, you know, the crew on the Pequod and Melville's writing and all those hints that something bad is going to happen. But, I mean, come on, this is Moby-Dick. We all know how this journey ends, right?
Right into the storm.
Yeah.
You know, in every sense of the word. That last fight between Ahab and Moby-Dick, it's one of the most intense and tragic parts of any book I've ever read.
Yeah, it really is. It's like one of those Greek tragedies, you know, only it's happening out on the ocean. One of the reviewers said how Melville uses those 3 days of the chase to build up this crazy tension. It's like a countdown, and you just know something terrible is about to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just all the action that's going on, it's what's happening inside Ahab, too. Melville really shows us all his thoughts and emotions. You know, how he's fighting with his obsession and his anger and realizing that he might not make it out of this.
It's like he's battling his own personal white whale inside, you know, those dark impulses that are trying to take over. And then there's the Pequod itself. It's this grand ship, but it becomes like a trap and a tomb for everyone on board.
The Pequod sinking, it's symbolic on so many levels. You know, it shows how foolish human pride can be, thinking we can control nature.
Yeah.
But it also shows just how destructive obsession can be. It blinds you to everything else and can lead you to ruin.
But even with all that destruction, there's this tiny little bit of hope. Ishmael survives.
It shows how strong the human spirit is. You know, that will to keep going even when you've lost everything. And remember, he makes it by holding on to Queequeg's coffin, which
Mhm.
is like this symbol of their friendship and how they understood each other's cultures.
It's such a powerful detail, and it makes you think that maybe the only way to make it through life is to be compassionate and connect with others and be open to people who are different from us.
And it's because Ishmael lives that we get to look back at everything that happened in the book and think about those big questions it asks. Moby-Dick actually wasn't a success when it first came out. People thought it was too depressing and confusing and difficult to read.
Really? That's hard to believe now that everyone considers it one of the greatest American novels.
I know, right? It took a long time for Moby-Dick to get the recognition it deserved. And I think the reason it's still so powerful is because it deals with those universal questions about our place in the world and the limits of what we can do and the impact of our choices.
It's definitely a book that stays with you. It makes you think about your own white whales, and the paths we choose in life.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how Moby-Dick has gone beyond just being a book. It's been adapted into movies and plays and music and art. It's become this cultural icon that represents the struggle between humanity and the unknown.
So to everyone listening, we encourage you to go back and read Moby-Dick, or maybe experience it for the first time. Don't be scared of how long it is or how complex it can be. Just let yourself get caught up in Melville's incredible writing and those unforgettable characters and his exploration of what it means to be human.
It's a journey you won't forget. And you never know, you might just learn something about yourself along the way.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Moby-Dick. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even thought-provoking happy reading.